Then, in 2005, French riots broke out between the police and youngsters in low-income neighborhoods in France. And politicians like Nicolas Sarkozy accused rappers of inciting violence. And then in that same year, passed a law that forced schools to teach pupils about the positives of colonization. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Thank you for being here. My name is Tandiwe, and today I'd like to talk about the recent racist backlash a month ago that one of the most prominent singers in France, Aya Nakamura, faced when there were rumors surrounding her potentially performing at the opening ceremony for the Paris Olympics that are happening this summer in 2024. And I would like to talk about specifically how this ties to this larger issue of like structural racism in France towards Black and brown communities in the country, but also the history of criminalizing non-white musical practices and artists that are tied to those genres that pose a threat to the white French establishment. So I think it's important to give some context before we start and get into like the more deeper topics. But who is Aya Nakamura? So Aya Nakamura is a French Malian singer. She was born in Mali and arrived in France when she was 6 years old. Her career as a musical artist really started to start in 2014 with songs like J'ai Mal and Karma. But she really blew up. Her biggest hit was in 2018, Jaja, which was her biggest hit in France, and it blew up internationally. She was the first French singer to reach #1 in the Netherlands since Edith Piaf in 1961. And after that, continued to release very popular hits like Copine, Dégaine, Pouki, and has collabed with really big names in the music industry like Ira Star, Maluma, and Major Lazer. So let's talk about the recent story that was surrounding her. This happened a month ago, but there were rumors surrounding her potentially being a performer for the opening ceremony at the Paris Olympic Games, which are happening this summer. And this incited a lot of racism from the far right in France. And one of the most notable incidents was of this extremist group. They went in Paris with this big banner and took a photo of themselves and posted it on social media, and the photo went viral. And the banner read, "No, Aya, this is Paris, not the Bamako market." And she responded with, "You can be racist, but not deaf. That's what hurts you. I'm becoming a #1 state subject in debates. But what do I really owe you? Nada." So her response to it was perfect. She said, I don't got no time for this. This is not cut that shit out," which was perfect. But I think it's important to kind of look at where this all comes from, because this is not just all happen in a vacuum. It does not only tie to racism that she has continuously dealt with, but it also ties to larger structures of structural racism in France that continues to exist in French society, specifically looking at the disregard that not only non-white communities face in France, but non-white French music also deals with and has continuously been subjected to in French society. One of the ways in which we can look at this issue is looking at the promotion of cultural nationalism through artistic practices within a country, a society. The best definition that I found for cultural nationalism was that it is a political and social movement that prioritizes the promotion and preservation of a particular culture or cultural identity within a nation. It often emphasizes the unique cultural traditions, language, history, and values of a specific group of people within a country. So for so long, cultural nationalism in France was mainly centered around white people. And because the country was largely white, really, until the 1950s, where there started to be an increase in immigration from France's former colonies around the 1960s and 1970s. And this increase in immigration from non-white countries led to a rise in the far right, because they perceived the increase of non-white immigrants as threatening to France's historically white landscape that they were so trying to maintain. And this is interesting because similar politics were taken into music, where music started to become more politicized as this non-white group was entering the musical landscape in the country and posing a threat to this notion of cultural nationalism. So one of the genres that is key to this conversation of racial politics and cultural nationalism in French music and French society is la chanson française, which literally translates to the French song. But it's an actual real music genre that actually has its origins from the 12th and 13th century during the medieval period. So it's a very old music genre. The songs are often very lyric driven and considered to be very poetic, where the singer is often in these songs telling a story combining poetry and music. It's very intertwined with French culture and French and like history and society. Its most prominent period were like in the 1960s and 1970s. Many of the singers that really promoted this genre nationally and internationally were singers like Charles Aznavour, Edith Piaf, Jacques Brel, Georges Brassens, and Claude François. So if you're not familiar with like French music, la chanson française in French society, you have probably like 90% probably heard like a chanson française songs. Some of Edith Piaf's songs have been like sampled on TikTok and used in reels. A lot of these songs have been used in like movie soundtracks and whatnot. The best example I can give was Bad Bunny's recent album. The song Monaco was a sample of Charles Aznavour's song Hier encore, which is a chanson française song. So there you have it. And this is one of France's like most prominent music genres. It is the image that France has proudly exported to the world for so many years, and it's considered to be sophisticated, synonymous with French identity, and part of French tradition and pride. And the genre has majority been like racialized as white, because like most of the singers in the genre are white, and the type of racial politics that I'll discuss with other genres that are not white, chanson française like did not go through that type of like racialization, because it's a white music genre. The racialization was oftentimes like positive, because it was a sustainment of a white French identity. And it basically dominated the charts and everything for many years, but that did start to change with globalization and the entrance of American music into French society. So globalization led to the increase of English language music in the French music mainstream, and music in English started to pose a threat to very prominent French music genres like la chanson française and others, to the point where the government actually had to step in and pass this law called La Loi du Tout Bon in 1994, where 40% of the music that was being played on radio stations had to be in French. And it was very interesting because this actually led to an increase in the propagation of French rap, because that was one of the most prominent genres at the time. The genre started in the 1970s, 1980s, and came out of low-income and non-white communities in France. It allowed them also to gain visibility through this musical practice. It was very much influenced by American hip-hop and rap in its lyrics, in its production, and also in the topics that it covers, oftentimes criticizing the status quo and calling out, systematic racism within society. The emergence of French rap also led to a lot of targeted repression of this musical genre, and a lot of racialized language that was used to not only criminalize the musical genre itself, but the communities that took part in the creation and the propagation of this musical genre. A way to understand a lot of the reaction that French rap had, specifically coming from white French society, is to understand how the genre was perceived as being a threat to white French cultural nationalism, and it was understood as being like anti-establishment. So there are many examples that I could use to kind of like highlight this, but I put together like a few key points like from some of the readings that I did. But in 1994, Ministère de la Mer, which was a French rap group, released a song called Sacrifice du Poulet. It was an anti-police song, and it specifically talked about police violence in low-income communities and the high criminalization of these communities by the French police. They performed the song and were fined $250,000 for spewing anti-police rhetoric. And then in the early 2000s, Interior Minister Nicolas Sarkozy alleged that rap was promoting anti-white racism. Then, in 2005, French riots broke out between the police and youngsters in low-income neighborhoods in France. And politicians like Nicolas Sarkozy accused rappers of inciting violence. And then in that same year, passed a law that forced schools to teach pupils about the positives of colonization. And when I read that, I literally like just paused. I was like, wait, what? And it just highlights how much of a threat rap and the manifestation of art from low-income communities in France, specifically Black and Arab, were posing a threat to the white French establishment. And it's so interesting. On one hand, you have the scapegoating of rappers, accusing them of inciting violence instead of tackling like serious structural issues that impact Black and brown communities in the country. And then on the other hand, it's so interesting how white French society and white French establishment perceive the genre as putting forward conversations regarding discrimination and racial marginalization that are connected to France's colonial legacy that they are so always trying to like suppress. Like this is like they're always trying to suppress that conversation. And it's interesting because a lot of discourse surrounding police brutality, racism, accountability for their colonial crimes, they not only try and like gloss over them or like kind of sweep past them, but they've constantly tried to repress them. And a lot of times like discourses like regarding like racism and police brutality, they consider it to be like an American phenomenon. They're like, oh no, we don't have that in France, like that's like an American thing. And I'm just like, no, given your colonial history and the type of racism that exists in France, it is not an American phenomenon. Those things exist alive and well in France just like they exist alive and well in the United States. As we have conversations surrounding how France continuously tries to like suppress and erase any discourse surrounding racial discrimination within the society, I think it's important to take a look at a lot of the targeted rhetoric and racialization of low-income spaces in France and how it ties back to the conversation regarding music. So a lot of Black and brown communities in France that live in mostly low-income neighborhoods known as the banlieues have long been at the epicenter of this kind of perceived threat to cultural nationalism and are perceived as like this rejection to the cultural nationalist ideals that white French society continues to try and transpose onto these like non-white populations. And it highlights like this type of like segregation that exists in French society between white French society and non-white French society, specifically kind of like this spatial distancing and targeted image of these neighborhoods that white French society has consistently tried to reinforce onto these populations. The rhetoric that I kind of spoke about with like regarding music, like non-white French music, is similarly transposed onto these distinctive populations. There are a few examples that I can give. So like 50% of French people have a negative image of youngsters that come from these neighborhoods, and 7 out of 10 French people perceive the banlieue as being like dangerous, and a lot of other negative stereotypes circulate around these people in these neighborhoods. And all these attempts to try and create the separation between white and non-white French society, music kind of like disrupts these barriers, because this music that's connotated with these neighborhoods and these people goes against those barriers that are reinforced by society as it's like propagated in the French mainstream, you know? And it's so interesting, a lot of like these fears regarding like cultural nationalism and whatnot, because this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think that it does make me think a little bit about the whole racist discourse regarding the hijab in France, like trying to like remove it and whatnot. And there are many ways in which this conversation can be had. I'll put a link to a video that kind of discusses it more in depth, because I think it's a very important like conversation to have. But two of the main things is that it highlights a threat to white French cultural nationalism that they're so heavily trying to reinforce. And it also is a constant reminder of an increasing and thriving non-white French cultural identity that France is so desperately trying to repress. So yeah, I just found like that to kind of be interesting, and like tying it back to this conversation regarding the consistent suppression of Black and brown communities in France. So a lot of the repression that continues to be seen towards like what wasn't continues to be like targeted towards rap can be used to understand how many Black and brown artists who might not be a part of the genre continue to be understood in French society. And this brings us back to the whole conversation with Aya Nakamura and a lot of the hysteria surrounding her performing or potentially performing at the Paris Olympic Games. And it's interesting because when I did watch the Olympics, I only watched the sports. I didn't really care about the opening ceremony, but I do remember for Brazil, for the opening ceremony, they had Gisele Bündchen, that's her pronunciation, I hope, and who was a white Brazilian model from the south of Brazil, and they had her catwalk to the song Girl from Ipanema, which is a bossa nova song. And the genre, I'm not too sure about its origins, but I do know that it's definitely seen positively in the eyes of white society in Brazil. And it's so interesting how during the opening ceremony in Brazil, like that was an image that they were propagating over Brazil on the world stage to the world, you know? And so going back to Aya, it's interesting how like there's all of this hysteria and everything, because white French society wants to sustain this image of white in France to the world, and having someone like Aya there singing to the people and everything, to the world and everything, disrupts what they're still trying to hold on to. And one of the discourses that consistently revolves around her, that honestly I'm so tired of, is whether she sings in French or not. And the reason why that's a conversation is because she uses a lot of slang that's associated with many black and brown communities in France that French society is so trying to repress. And there's all of this talk whether she should be the ambassador of the French language and whatnot. And the reason why is because they see her as a threat to, like, her songs and everything are like influencing what is considered to be French culture, right? It's challenging what is considered to be French culture. And a lot of this repression and whatnot, like suppression, goes beyond that. Like, even at award shows and everything, she was long snubbed by Victoire de la Musique, which is like the French Grammys and everything, for many, many years. In 2020, she was like the most listened to French singer, and it went to this other singer called Plum. And even Plum, herself, she was like, the only reason why I got this award is because I was white and I came from a privileged background, unlike Aya Nakamura. So even Bum herself was like, yo, like, y'all didn't give it to me for the right reasons. But she did eventually get the award in 2024. Well deserved. So yeah, it took a little while, but yeah, she deserved it for sure. It's interesting because a lot of this rhetoric surrounding whether Aya sings in French or not also stems from France's like colonial history and present, right? Specifically the concept of mission civilisatrice. And mission civilisatrice is basically this concept that France would enforce onto the populations of countries that they were colonizing. And it was basically this idea of, if you spoke, if you ate, if you acted, if you talked like us and whatnot, you were considered like French. So France, in comparison to other forms of colonization that was like, you would never be like us regardless of what you do because you're inferior to us, France would construct kind of like this unattainable image of, oh, if you do all of these things, then you can be considered civilized in French. And this was obviously done in a way to look down and repress the cultures of the people that they were colonizing. And it's so interesting because one of the tools of mission civilisatrice was this idea of maintaining the purity of the French language. And it's so interesting because French, like, if I take English, for example, right? I can speak with an American accent, with a British accent, with an accent, I don't know, from Zimbabwe, an accent from Brazil. I can speak English like with any accent that I want. And as long as my vocabulary is correct and I pronounce the words in a way that like people can like understand and have a conversation with me, I speak English. And it's not to say that like people don't face discrimination for like speaking English in accents that are not considered like white or like American and British and whatnot, but you're still considered to like speak English. And it's so interesting because with French, if you do not speak French with a French accent, it has been so reinforced that like you don't speak French, or you don't speak French properly. You can speak the most sophisticated French. If you do not speak French people are so high maintenance about the accent, the pronunciation, the type of words that you use. You can like, it's so like maintained, and it ties back to their whole colonial like concepts of like trying to like kind of like maintain the purity of the French language. And it's also this idea you always want to be like looking up to them and having them as your gaze, and having like the white French language from France as your gaze, and like that's what you want to be aspiring to. But then someone like Aya Nakamura or other non-black and non-white artists come along who sing French and who are perfectly singing in French, but that use slang and rhetoric that is not associated with white French culture, and that not only disrupts the purity of the French language, but it also shows that her gaze is not directed towards white French people. It's directed towards brown and black people in France that have used a lot of rhetoric that have been influenced by a lot of like the indigenous languages that they spoke in those respective countries, you know? So it's just really interesting like looking at a lot of that rhetoric that they use towards her, and how it ties to not only those past systems of colonization, but how those systems of colonization continue to be perpetuated and today France. Back to la chanson française and, you know, the prominent singers like Edith Piaf and whatnot. A lot of the hysteria and fear frustration surrounding Aya Nakamura is that she appropriates like a lot of the notoriety that like a lot of very prominent white French chanson française singers like Edith Piaf and Charles Aznavour had, and it kind of confirms this fear from like white French society that there's this increasing non-white French presence that's like coming into French society and dominating in French society. And she's like, I mean, she's like huge. She's number one in France. Like, she had like concerts in Paris, like for shows, whatever. She had 3 shows in Paris. They sold out in 15 minutes. 15 in Paris. 15 minutes. Like, she's huge. And so every single one of her successes, of these moments, is a constant reminder to white French society that you have this huge like non-white French singer that's dominating basically like globally and everything, and that's becoming the image of France that they don't want to sustain. They don't want that image to be perpetuated. And it's just, and you know, even the whole thing about how like she was like the first singer like since Edith Piaf to be like number one in like the Netherlands, like that's crazy, you know. And so it explains a lot of the racism and discrimination that, you know, she like encountered specifically recently and also throughout like her career and everything. So and to conclude on some of these points, like I thought that it was important to talk about this because I saw how it tied into larger issues of structural racism that continue to persist in French society. I also thought that it provided me with like kind of like a little bit of an analysis of France's history of colonization of Black and brown peoples and how it continues to impact them in today's society. And I found the critique around her to be very interesting, obviously problematic, but interesting because it helped you understand a lot of these systems that were at play. And it tied into like these larger discussions of the criminalization and the repression of Black and brown peoples in these countries, or even like just their musical practices that are seen as a threat to the establishment. So if you stayed this far, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think of the video in the comments. If you have like any points that you thought like were interesting, you'd like to add to the conversation, and also let me know if there are like other like videos that I should do. Like I really like doing like videos and like talking about like music and how politics and society plays into the making and the critiquing of music genres that specifically come from Black and brown communities. So yeah, thank you for watching, and bye.